I have this friend, Sarah, who's really passionate about politics, and her dad is too. For most of Sarah's life, she and her father agreed on almost everything. Healthcare, taxes, the right to digital privacy, the environment, you name it. Sure, of course. There were little disagreements here and there, but for the most part, they agreed. Sarah may have wanted cap and trade and a more open immigration policy, while her dad favored a carbon tax and stronger borders. But for the most part, they agreed. And then came the 2016 election. Sometime around June or July 2016, it was suddenly as if an invisible yet tangible gulf separated the two of them. Before, they had both felt that the other person reached his or her opinion based on a thoughtful, reasoned analysis of the facts. Now, they felt that the other's opinion was motivated by fear, xenophobia, and naivety. They were upset even when they weren't talking about politics. It got to the point where they could barely be in the same room with one another. It was affecting their relationship, and they knew they needed to resolve it. So being two rational, thoughtful, and caring people, what did they do? Did they calmly take turns presenting their arguments, trying to understand what factors in the other person's life caused them to conclude differently? Were they open to hearing what the other one had to say? Was one of them convinced by the other person's thoughtful and reasoned analysis? What do you think?
No.
Of course not. Over and over, each time they talked about politics, they would repeat their facts as if they were talking points written for a press secretary. When Sarah brought up a convincing point, a point that she knew would convince the dad that she knew, based on the values that he himself had tried to impart in her, he would tell her she was missing the point. They didn't talk to each other. They talked at each other. Everything they said went in one ear and out the other. Now, you're probably sitting there thinking, you're different from Sarah and her dad. I may have my opinion, sure, but I'm open-minded. I listen. But there's new scientific evidence that says we really aren't open to being convinced, that we don't listen. A 2016 study by researchers at the University of Southern California shows that we are biologically hardwired not to be open to listening to political opinions that differ from our own. The study found that when humans are confronted with political beliefs that they disagree with, the parts of the brain that are involved in personal identity and emotional response to threat are activated. And the brain reacts similarly to how it reacts in the face of other threats. In other words, an alarm goes off in the brain saying that our identity, that who we are, is being challenged. Once we feel like that, we can't possibly listen. The rational side of our brain shuts down, and we disregard any logical evidence that contradicts what we believe to be true. For example, imagine a Yankees fan trying to logically convince a die-hard, lifelong Red Sox fan to start rooting for the Yankees by telling him that Yankees games are so much fun and they're the winningest team in the history of baseball. Good luck with that. Dr. Jonas Kaplan, one of the study's authors, explains that, and I quote, "Political beliefs are like religious beliefs in the respect that both are part of who you are and important for the social circle to which you belong. To consider an alternative view, you would have to consider an alternative version of yourself." Wow. So Dr. Kaplan is saying that not only do we not listen to the arguments of those with whom we disagree, but their arguments actually increase our conviction in our own beliefs. Psychologically, it is easier for us to dig in and say, I am right, than to admit to ourselves that we may be someone other than who we thought we were, other than who we tell our friends we are, other than who we thought we wanted to be. However, it's not just that humans are biologically wired so that it's difficult to listen to those with whom we disagree. We also make choices that make it almost entirely and completely impossible to actually hear them. Just think about where you get your news. Now, I know what you're probably thinking. My news is unbiased. It's the other side. It's Fox or Breitbart, or it's MSNBC and the New York Times. The ones I would never watch or read or listen to. Those are the ones with fake news. Now, personally, I know that when I watch one news channel in particular, whose base I'm not politically aligned with, I can literally feel my blood pressure start to rise. I promise. I think to myself, wow, how are they spewing those lies? How can their viewers be so naive to believe that this is true? Don't they see the anchors are biased? Isn't it obvious? Now, I'd like to think that I am normally a nice, calm person. But watching that channel makes me angry. And because it literally causes me physiological distress to watch or listen to that channel, I don't listen to the other side. I can't even hear them. But I'm not alone. Each person on each side thinks that his or her news is accurate and the other side's is biased. We don't watch a mixture from all sides. We don't take a little helping of MSNBC with our breakfast, listen to Fox and Friends on the radio en route to work, read the NewYorkTimes.com when we should be responding to our colleagues' emails, and then head over to Breitbart for our evening browsing on the couch. We don't listen to the other side because we can't bear to hear what they have to say. But it's not only that people don't want to listen to the other side. A 2015 study by Ira Sweet, a researcher at Stanford University, found that our polarization even extends to where we choose to live. Don't get me wrong, it's not the primary factor. People still make their decision on where to buy or rent based on safety, amenities, schools, and distance to the workplace. However, the Stanford study found that people, and I quote, who identify as either Democrat or Republican desire neighborhoods with people who share their political preferences when they're given that information. Hui's research found that a sizable presence of co-partisans can increase the desirability of a location by 20%. And she found that the reverse is also true. When the respondents were told that a location had a sizable presence of people of the opposite party, the desirability of that location decreased by approximately 20%. Though the magnitude of this effect isn't huge, it serves as yet another indication of this troubling trend. Americans are retreating from those we disagree with, and we are situating ourselves in echo chambers, unable to see the morality and the humanity of those across the aisle from us. It often feels like as a society, we've never been more divided. When so many in our country find it so hard to listen to each other and to hear other people's opinions, when we can't agree on what is true and what is not, and when it seems like if it's even possible, we are moving further and further apart from the other side, where do we look for hope? I'd like to share a little-known story about a much darker time. It is early in the summer of 1945. Though they had just been defeated, the Nazis had almost completely rid the European continent of its Jews. 1,000 years of Jewish history, language, and culture were destroyed. 6 million Jewish grandparents, loving mothers, fathers, sisters, brothers, little boys and girls, all decimated at the hands of the Nazi killing machine. But just when the Jewish voice of Europe could no longer be heard, a story of hope arose. In an effort to save them, some Jewish families had sent their small children to live with Christian neighbors or in Christian orphanages during the war. Other Jewish children adopted this same strategy after escaping from ghettos or concentration camps. Though many children's lives were saved in this manner, and thank God that they were, their Jewish heritage and identities were to be lost to history. But early that summer, in the summer of 1945, Rabbi Yosef Shlomo Kahneman set out to find those Jewish children and to bring them back to their Judaism, to bring them back to what remained of the Jewish people. Now, Rabbi Kahneman faced two primary problems. First, the authorities almost always insisted that there were no Jewish children in their orphanages. And second, and perhaps more important, almost all of the children were too afraid, after all that they had been through, to admit that they were Jewish. So, accompanied by American officers, Rabbi Kahneman would visit the orphanages. He'd go into their bedrooms at night as they were laying in bed, and he would softly call out, Shema Yisrael. The Jewish children, even those too young to remember or too scared to admit, would cry out. It was those words, Shema Yisrael, hear, O Israel, listen up, Israel, that brought those poor, orphaned, remaining Jews of Europe back into the Jewish people. Those words, Shema Yisrael, have given the Jewish people hope, even in the darkest of times. Is it a coincidence that those words, the watchword of our faith, Shema Yisrael, Adonai Eloheinu, Adonai Echad, the words that every Jew around the world knows, begin with the call, the charge, hear, O Israel, listen, listen, O people, Israel? I think not. The phrase that we know, the Shema, is not the only instance of Shema Yisrael in the Torah. The words Shema Yisrael, listen, Israel, appear in the Torah 4 times, all in the final book, Deuteronomy. Deuteronomy captures the last interactions that Moses had with the Israelites, as he tries to teach them God's laws and lessons before they enter the Promised Land. Before Moses tells the Israelites the laws for how to act morally in the war that they will inevitably begin when they enter the land, before he tells them how to build a just society once they're the ones in charge, there are 2 words that precede those laws. Shema Yisrael. The first thing they have to do is Shema Yisrael, is listen. If we want to build a just society, the first thing we must do is listen. And this day too, Rosh Hashanah, is all about listening. It's about listening to ourselves. Traditionally, on Rosh Hashanah, we ask ourselves, what have I done over this past year that is good? And what have I done over this past year that is bad? How have I missed the mark? However, the goal of Rosh Hashanah is not simply to ask the questions, but to be brave enough to listen to the answers. Rosh Hashanah is also about listening to others. It begins the Aseret Yamei Teshuvah, the 10 days of repentance. During these days, we don't just ask God for forgiveness. We also ask it from the people in our lives. True repentance requires a heartfelt desire to not commit the same offense again. And that requires listening. How can we know how to do better next time without listening to how we hurt or how we wronged the other person, how our actions made them feel, how that person thinks we can make it right? if we want to treat our loved ones and friends better, we have to listen. Now, the most iconic part of the Rosh Hashanah holiday is undoubtedly the shofar. Interestingly, the mitzvah, the commandment of the shofar in Rosh Hashanah isn't to blow it, but to hear it. To hear it. In fact, the sages teach that someone who blows the shofar but does not hear it, I know that sounds weird, but in the Mishnah and the Talmud they give an example that actually makes sense. But if someone blows the shofar and doesn't hear it, that person doesn't fulfill the commandment. Many times throughout history, the Israelites and the Jewish people used the shofar as a way to call out to God. We know from the Mishnah that in cases of prolonged drought, after weeks and months, when the prayer of the heart and the prayer of the lips failed to bring out God's mercy and bring down rain, the Jews turned to the shofar. It sounded a plea that would leave this world and echo in the heavens above, and God willing, be heard. Today, on Rosh Hashanah, we ask God to write our names in Sefer HaChaim, the book of life. So if we are asking God to hear us, why then is the mitzvah to hear the shofar, for us to hear it and not to blow it? Rabbi Reuven Brand explains, the shofar's wordless cry is a call to better ourselves, to extricate ourselves from our current slumber. Hearing the shofar arouses within us the desire to improve our lives. End quote. Therefore, even though today of all days, when we want more than anything for God to hear our plea for life, the holiday reminds us to listen. The shofar is a call to admit to ourselves that we're not perfect, that we all make mistakes. But the strength and the purity of that call also remind us that we can change, that we can grow, that we can become better people. If today we let down our internal defenses and we admit to ourselves how we need to and how we can improve, maybe we can also learn how to let down our defenses in other situations. Perhaps this exercise of listening to the things we don't normally want to admit about ourselves will teach us how to listen to and learn from people with whom we disagree. Pirkei Avot, or Ethics of the Fathers, as it's called in English, is one of Judaism's oldest ethical guides. In it, Ben Zoma, a rabbinical student from 2,000 years ago, teaches, "Who is wise? He who learns from all people." The discord and the division that we have in our society today isn't new. You all know the old joke, 2 Jews, 3 opinions. But the earliest rabbis knew, if we want to be united as a society, if we want to be wise, if we want to make progress, we have to listen to and learn from all people, even those with whom we disagree. And this wasn't simply hollow advice. The rabbis lived by these words. If any of you have ever studied the Talmud, which is the oral Torah and the rabbi's commentary on it, you know that when the rabbis laid out their interpretation of the laws, they didn't just state the majority opinion of the rabbis and then move on. Instead, for discussion after discussion, law after law, the Talmud not only lists the majority opinion, which therefore became the law, but it also leaves in the minority opinions. In a text that was so central to their understanding of how God wanted them to behave in the world, the rabbis made sure to include the opinions of the people that disagreed with them. and they did so with the utmost respect. Can you imagine the hyper-partisan media of today doing such a thing? It's unthinkable. But that underscores how important our Jewish tradition tells us it is to listen to those with whom we disagree. In my favorite poem in the High Holiday Prayer Book, the Unatan Tokef, which we read on both Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur, out of many beautiful lines, one stands out. The great shofar is sounded, the still, small voice is heard. It's a reference to the story of the prophet Elijah and his encounter with God. God told Elijah to go stand on a mountain so God could meet him. The text tells us, and I quote, "There was a great and mighty wind, splitting mountains and shattering rocks by the power of God." But God was not in the wind. After the wind, an earthquake. But God was not in the earthquake. After the earthquake, fire. But God was not in the fire. And after the fire, a still, small voice. God came to Elijah as a still, small voice. And so says the Unatan Tokef. The great shofar is sounded, but the still small voice is heard. This year, may we find the clarity of mind to look past the earthquakes, the fires, and the wind. May we take the opportunity to listen to ourselves. And even though it's difficult and maybe even against our wiring as humans, may we be open to listening to and learning from all people, even those with whom we disagree. Shana Tova and Gemar Chatima Tova. Happy New Year, and may we all be inscribed in the book of life.
Amen.